essentially, in the first two halves of the book, we see Winston commit thought crime, commit all kinds of crimes that the big brother does not allow, because the big brother determines the truth. Big brother determines reality. Big brother tells you what to do and what not to do. And if you defy Big Brother's principles, you're screwed. And he had prophesied his death very early on in the book, but he just didn't know when it was coming. So in the third half of the book, we find him being tortured, being jailed and tortured by officials, by party officials, and specifically this man named O'Brien, who he thought he could trust because, well, it was mostly intuition and mostly some kind of like, and actually, interestingly, in some ways he could trust O'Brien, but not in a way that O'Brien would be loyal to him, but that O'Brien would understand. And that's what he says in the book, that what he had with O'Brien was a little more than friendship. They were cellmates. He could, because he was so intelligent, this man who was torturing him, because he could see through his mind, like he could read his thoughts as soon as he had them. In some ways, they were pals in some twisted, distorted way. So anyway, that's enough of a background. So yeah, essentially what O'Brien tries to do is okay, I don't want to give away the entire idea behind this video, but I just wanted to give you a background to what I would be talking about. Right, so this is page 237 in my copy of 1984, where O'Brien explains to Winston why he is jailed. So he's in the Ministry of Love, which is actually the Ministry of Torture, which is how doublethink works. So he sort of tells Winston why Winston is here. So O'Brien says, on the contrary, one second. Right. So firstly, O'Brien talks about the party slogan, which is who controls the past controls the future, and who controls the present controls the past. So Winston disagrees with him by saying that you cannot change memory, that what a human being experiences, that is something you absolutely cannot control. And so how can you believe that you are an absolute power? How can you believe that so he sort of defies the authority of Big Brother. And so O'Brien asks him, so then where does the past exist, if at all? Winston says, in records, it is written down. And then O'Brien's like, okay, in records and so Winston says, in the mind, in the human memories. And so O'Brien says, in memory, okay, very well then, we, the party, we control the records and we control our memories. Then we control the past, do we not? But then Winston says, but then how can you stop people from remembering things? It is involuntary. It is outside oneself. How can you control memory? How can we not? You have not been able to control mine. So O'Brien responds to that by saying, on the contrary, he said, you have not controlled it. So he's behaving as an emotionally abusive, manipulative, like what is typical of doublethink, which is defeating logic by logic itself, and sort of twisting the truth to question the truth. And I'm so sorry, I'm not good at this because I happen to be a sane, rational person. But I'm just going to read out from what Brian says. So Brian says, on the contrary, he said, you have not controlled it. That is what has brought you here. You are here, meaning you are here in the Ministry of Love, because you have failed in humility, in self-discipline. You would not make the act of submission, which is the price of sanity. You have preferred to be a lunatic, a minority of one. Only the disciplined mind can see reality, Winston. You believe that reality is something objective, it's something external, existing in its own right. So here I would like you to think about my videos on Einstein. Remember what Einstein says? That there's a reality independent of the human mind, of human beings. Something like gravity. Something that the human mind does not have to interfere in for it to be real. That we didn't create gravity, we just discovered it. So he's basically telling Winston that you believe that there is something external of the human mind. That is not true. Everything exists within the mind, which is to say, अगर हर चीज़ हमारे दिमाग में, if everything lies inside our head, if everything is a construct, then why can't we destroy it? If there is no truth, if there is no reality, why can't we destroy it? If everything is an illusion, why can't we destroy it? And why can't we control it? They're not interested in destroying reality, which is what they do, but to control it. So he says, you also believe that the nature of reality is self-evident. When you delude yourself into thinking that you see something, you assume that everybody else sees the same thing as you. But I tell you, Winston, that reality is not external. Reality exists in the human mind, nowhere else. Not in the individual mind, which can make mistakes, and in any case soon perishes. Only in the mind of the party, which is collective and immortal, is where reality resides. Whatever the party holds to be the truth is truth. It is impossible to see reality except by looking through the eyes of the party. That is the fact that you have got to relearn, Winston. It needs an act of self-destruction, an effort of the will. You must humble yourself before you can remain sane, or before you can become sane. And I would like you to not just let these words sink into you, but also listen to words like the act of self-destruction. It's very interesting. It's not self-abnegation, it's not self-sacrifice, it's self-destruction. It's not like giving yourself away to receive something. This is not that. This is not a surrender. This is slavery. He's not saying that, but he's implying that. Because that's the rule of doublethink. They will use one word while implying the other. They will say things like freedom is slavery, but is it? And I'll go back to that passage where Winston tells you how doublethink works. I'm sorry, I'm taking a little while with this, but you can just chill out here. This is page 38. I have read this out in my previous video before, but just to show you how doublethink works in practice. It is something like this. To know and not to know. To be conscious of complete truthfulness while telling carefully constructed lies. To hold simultaneously two opinions which cancelled out, knowing them to be contradictory and believing in them both. To use logic against logic. To repudiate morality while laying claim to it. To believe that democracy was impossible, but that the party was the guardian of democracy. To forget whatever it was necessary to forget, and then to draw it back into memory again at the moment when it was needed, and then promptly to forget it again. And above all, to apply the same process to the process itself. That is the ultimate subtlety. Consciously to induce unconsciousness. And then once again to become unconscious of the act of hypnosis you've just performed. Even to understand the word doublethink would involve the need to understand how to use doublethink. And remember that whole part where he gets so frustrated and he says, the freedom is the ability to say 2 + 2 is 4. So there's this whole part where O'Brien tries to convince him that 2 + 2 in fact is not 4, it is 5, because I tell you it is 5. And I'll get to that soon. But yeah, I want all of you to listen to the words like self-destruction and effort of the will. How he talks about the idea of the collective. And by the collective, he does not mean a community. He does not mean all of us living in harmony with each other. But a sense of exactly this, the idea of losing one's identity to become a part of something, to become part of a herd, where none of you have thoughts of your own, but you're just being herded on by this master who you have unconsciously declared to be, somebody who can save you, who can guide you. Okay, so I think I'm going to read out the whole 4-5 thing. The whole part where he tries to convince Winston. Okay. Let me not get ahead of myself and narrate an incident before I've actually narrated it. So O'Brien paused for a few moments as though to allow what he had been saying to sink in. So O'Brien says, "Do you remember writing in your diary that freedom is freedom? Freedom is the freedom to be able to say 2 plus 2 is 4. Yes, said Winston. So O'Brien held up his left hand, its back towards Winston, with the thumb hidden and the 4 fingers extended. How many fingers am I holding up, Winston? He says 4. And if the party says that it's not 4 but 5, then how many would you say they are? Winston says 4. The word ended in a gasp of pain. So because he's been tied up in some kind of like a torture machine where every time he says the wrong answer, he's like shot up with some kind of, I think, electric bolt. The needle of the dial had shot up to 55, so that's 55 volts of some electricity, which signifies the pain level. How much pain will he experience? So the sweat had sprung up all over Winston's body, the air tore into his lungs and issued again in deep groans, which even by clenching his teeth he could not stop. O'Brien watched him, the 4 fingers still extended. He drew back the lever. This time the pain was only slightly eased. How many fingers, Winston? 4. The needle went up to 60. How many fingers, Winston? 4. 4. What else can I say? 4. The needle must have risen again, but he need not look at it. The heavy, stern face and the 4 fingers filled his vision. The fingers stood up before his eyes like pillars, enormous, blurry, and seeming to vibrate, but unmistakably 4. How many fingers, Winston? 4! Stop it! How can you go on? It's 4! How many fingers, Winston? 5, 5, 5! No, Winston, that's no use. You're lying. You still think there are 4 fingers. How many fingers? 5, 4. I don't know anything you like. Please just stop. So at this point, Winston is just so tortured that he's like, please just let me go. I don't care. And so abruptly he was sitting up in O'Brien's arm, with O'Brien's arm around his shoulders. He had perhaps lost consciousness for a few seconds. The bonds that had held his body down were loosened. He felt very cold. He was shaking uncontrollably. His teeth were chattering. The tears were rolling down his cheeks. For a moment, he clung on to O'Brien like a baby, curiously comforted by the heavy arm around his shoulders. He had the feeling that O'Brien was his protector, that the pain was something that came from the outside, from some other source, and it was O'Brien who would save him from it. So this is very interesting because what O'Brien essentially does and consistently does is he becomes the source of his pain but also eases that pain. So it's like an abusive relationship where, this person hurts you, but then where else will you find solace except in their arms? So it becomes like an addiction. Like you cannot, stop yourself from going to them. And it's, a lot like Stockholm Syndrome, basically. So he continues the same charade, and then eventually he says, So finally, O'Brien asks him, so how many fingers, Winston? And Winston continues to say, 4. I suppose there are 4. I would see 5 if I could. I am trying to see 5. And then O'Brien asks him a very curious question, from which I have derived the title and the inspiration of this video. He asks him, which do you wish, Winston? To persuade me that you see 5 or to really see them? And then Winston says, really to see them. Again, says O'Brien. And then the needle is shot up again. So the whole point is that for Winston to believe in what O'Brien is saying, he needs to see some kind of evidence. But O'Brien says, I want you to stop seeking evidence and believe me because I am powerful, because I am a party member. Believe me because I am an authority figure. It doesn't fucking matter if you actually, if I'm speaking the truth. If I say it's the truth, it must be the truth. So again, the idea of consciously inducing unconsciousness. Yeah. When he opened his eyes, it was to find out that he was still seeing the same thing. Innumerable fingers like moving trees were still streaming past in either direction, crossing and recrossing. He shut his eyes again. How many fingers am I holding up, Winston? I don't know. You will kill me if you do that again. 4, 5, 6. In all honesty, I don't fucking know. So at this point, he is so tortured with pain that he can't see clearly, and he doesn't understand the point of his exercise. He's like, if you just want to kill me, just kill me. Why are you doing this? So then O'Brien says, okay, that's better. And so a needle is slid into Winston's arms. Almost in the same instant, a blissful healing warmth spread all through his body. The pain was already half forgotten. He opened his eyes and looked up gratefully at Brian. Do you see again how the same man who's torturing him suddenly also becomes like this kind of comfort? And it's not just in this scenario. Like I said, even before, in the first two parts of the book, O'Brien and Winston develop some kind of understanding with each other, and Winston believes that's because of O'Brien's superior intelligence, and he feels that he's among the few who really still has some kind of intellectual, the ability to be an intellectual, in a dumbed down audience. He's still somebody who can still have an actual conversation with. Which is not to say that he's not completely lunatic, but it is to say that he's an intelligent lunatic, if that makes sense. So at the sight of the heavy lined face, so ugly and so intelligent, his heart seemed to turn over. If he could have moved, he would have stretched out a hand and laid it on Brian's arm. He would never have loved him so deeply as at this moment, and not merely because he'd stopped the pain. The old feeling that that at the bottom it did not matter whether O'Brien was a friend or an enemy had come back. O'Brien was a person who could be spoken to. He could be talked to. Perhaps one did not want to be loved so much as to be understood. So then O'Brien tries to ask him, why do you think you're here? And how long have you been here? So obviously Winston has no sense of time, but his answer to why he was here is, I believe that I'm here to make he doesn't just ask him why you are here, but why do you think we bring people here? So he says it is to make them confess. So O'Brien says, no, that's not the reason, try again. Then Winston says, to punish them. O'Brien says, no. Then his voice changes, and then he becomes animated in like a sick way. He says, no, not merely to extract your confession, nor to punish you. Shall I tell you why we've really brought you here? We want to cure you. We want to make you sane. Will you understand, Winston, that no one whom we bring to this place ever leaves our hands uncured? We are not interested in those stupid crimes that you've committed. No, the party is not interested in the overt act. The thought is all we care about. We do not merely destroy our enemies, Winston. We change them. Do you understand what I mean by that? So the first thing for you to understand in this is that in this place, there are no martyrdoms. You have read of the religious persecutions of the past. In the Middle Ages, there was the Inquisition. It was a failure. It set out to eradicate heresy and ended by perpetuating it. Because for every heretic that is burnt at the stakes, thousands of others rose up. And why was that? Because the Inquisition killed its enemies in the open and killed them while they were still unrepentant. In fact, it killed them because they were unrepentant. Men were dying because they would not abandon their true beliefs. Naturally, all the glory belonged to the victim and all the shame to the inquisitor who burned him. Later in the 20th century, there were the totalitarians, as they were called. They were the German Nazis and the Russian communists. The Russians persecuted heresy more cruelly than the Inquisition had done, and they imagined that they had learned from the mistakes of the past. They knew at any rate that one must not make martyrs. Before they exposed their victims to public trial, they deliberately set themselves to destroy their dignity. They wore them down by torture and solitude until they were despicable, cringing wretches, confessing whatever was put into their mouths, covering themselves with abuse, accusing and sheltering behind one another, whimpering for mercy. And yet, after only a few years, the same thing happened over again. The dead men had become martyrs and their degradation was forgotten. And once again, why was that? In the first place, because the confessions that they had made were obviously extorted and untrue. We don't make mistakes of that kind. All the confessions that are made here are true. We make them true. And above all, we don't allow the dead to rise up against us. You must stop imagining that posterity will vindicate you, Winston. Posterity will never hear of you. You will be lifted clean out of the stream of history, which shall turn you into gas and pour you into the stratosphere. Nothing will remain of you, not a name in the register, not a memory in a living brain. You will be annihilated in the past as well as in the future. You will never have existed. You are thinking that since we intend to destroy you utterly, nothing that you can say or do can make the smallest difference. So why in that case should we go through the trouble of interrogating you first? Isn't that what you were thinking? Winston says yes. So O'Brien says this: Winston, you are a flaw in the pattern. You are a stain that must be wiped out. Did I not just tell you now that we are different from the prosecutors of the past? We are not content with negative obedience, nor even with the most abject submission. When you finally surrender to us, which you will, it must be of your own free will. We do not destroy the heretic because he resists us. So long as he resists us, we never destroy him because he remains a heretic. We convert him. We capture his inner mind. We reshape him. We burn all evil and all illusion out of him. We bring him over to our side, not in appearance, but genuinely heart and soul. We make him one with ourselves before we kill him. It is intolerable to us that an erroneous thought should exist anywhere in the world, however secret and powerless it may be. Even in the instant of death, we cannot permit any deviation. In the old days, the heretic walked into the stake still a heretic, proclaiming his heresy, exulting in it. Even the victim of the Russian purges could carry rebellion locked up in his skull as he walked down the passage waiting for the bullet. But we make the brain perfect before we blow it out. The command of the old despotism was, "Thou shalt not." The command of the totalitarians was, "Thou shalt." Our command is, "Thou art." No one whom we bring to this place ever stands out against us. Everyone is washed clean. Even those 3 miserable traitors in whose innocence you once believed, in the end, we broke them down. I took part in their interrogation myself. I saw them gradually worn down, whimpering, groveling, weeping. And in the end, it was not with pain or fear, only with penitence. By the time we finished with them, they were only shells of men. There was nothing left in them except sorrow for what they'd done and the love for Big Brother. It was touching to see how they loved him. They begged to be shot, quickly, so that they could die while their minds were still clean. Do not imagine, Winston, that you will save yourself, however completely you surrender to us. No one who has once gone astray is ever spared. And even if we choose to let you live out the natural term of your life, still you will never escape from us. What happens to you here is forever. Understand that in advance. We shall crush you down to a point from which there is no coming back. Things will happen to you from which you will not recover. If you lived 1,000 years, never again will you be capable of an ordinary human feeling. Everything will be dead inside you. Never again will you be capable of love or friendship or joy of living or laughter or curiosity or courage or integrity. You will be hollow. We shall squeeze you empty and then we shall fill you with ourselves. So I wanted to then now discuss this one article from, I know, whoever was listening to all this, I know it's very heavy. It affects me too. But before I go on, I wanted to discuss this one article I found on Telegraph, not Telegram. Telegram is an app. It's called Bachahat Amin. It's an ironic article. It's an article on power, and so it's written by somebody called Sankarshan Thakur. And so the caption reads, before I go into the whole article, which is very small, it's like 4 paragraphs. But I'll first read the article and then you'll understand why I'm reading this article. So it says, we need more nationalism, and therefore the stink of it must spread more and more, so we become acquainted with what nationalism is and what it smells like. Anyway, again, it's called Badshahat, Badshahat, Badshahat Amin by Sankarshan Thakur on Telegraph, just to reiterate. And this was written on the 19th of April. Oh, I'm sorry, even I'm reeling from my narration of O'Brien's speech. It's very disturbing. Anyway, so this article goes something like this. The thing about power is, well, should I let it out in as open as space as a newspaper, which goes into hundreds of thousands of homes each morning and may be read by 5 times more? Should I let it out in a public space as a newspaper, which has become as daily as brushing your teeth, and before that or after that, other daily thing you do? You know what I'm referring to, but you don't make mention of it. Please don't stink up this space. We are already in the 6th year of those things. This is BJP, by the way. This place stinks and you made it so. My compliments. And why is that? Go guess. I'm the one who stinks and you are the one who brought me here and helped the stink spread so relentlessly and unapologetically that the stink has become the norm. We stink and therefore we are. We need the stink in order that we can be all the things that are necessary things, the right things, the done things, the nationalist things, all of them that stink. We need more nationalism, and therefore the stink of it must spread more and more, so we become acquainted with what nationalism is and what it smells like. It stinks. Smell it and pass it on. That's your duty. That is what I'm here to tell you. And I can and I will, because I have the power. And that power you gave me because you thought it fit, or you thought you had no other option. But here's the thing about power. Let me let it out. No harm. You won't get it. I am the appointed one. Your lot is to remain disappointed. No perils lie in revealing secrets upon those that can do nothing with this revelation, can draw no advantage of it. It is not such an advantage that you can even remotely disadvantage me. You are too weak and too reduced. I am too powerful and too enhanced. That is power. That is where it is drawn from the weakness of others. The weaker you are rendered, the more powerful I become. In order for me to have become what I am, there were requirements you needed to fulfill. I am not here to empower you. You are here to empower me. And for that, you need to be powerless, so that I am more powerful. You needed to hope, I made you hope. You needed to subscribe, I made you subscribe. You needed to supplicate, and I made you supplicate. You needed to allege, I made you allege. You needed to protest, I let you protest. You needed to be whipped, I had you whipped. You needed to plead, and I made you plead. You needed to pray, and I helped you pray to me for everything, because you are now powerless and I am the powerful one. I will go on and being so, and I shall go on doing to you what is required to ensure that you remain where you are, the powerless ones to my powerful self. I will snatch away your jobs so you can come to me seeking them. I will leave you hungry so you come to me crying to be fed. I will decree you may not have this, so you will come to me crawling to have it back. I will decree you may not have that, so you will come to me to grovel to have that back. I will drive you out of home, so you will come to me seeking shelter. I will order to have you wiped off the map, so you will come to me begging to be brought back on where you once were and have been all this time. I am what I am by the dint of ensuring that you are less and less of what you are. The more the deficits that are imposed on you, the more profits I accumulate on my powers. And that's the thing about power. It gains from inflicting losses. And then this article ends by this four-line poem, which goes something like this. The lower you are reduced, the loftier my majesty. The more weakened we induced, the more weakness we induced, the greater is power's travesty. You want me to repeat it? I'll repeat it. The lower you are reduced, the loftier my majesty. The more weakness we induced, the greater is power's travesty. Do you understand now why I read this out? Yeah. Anyway, back to 1984. So now we are on page 247. So now Winston is asking, one second, I think there's too much darkness. Yeah, Winston is asking O'Brien if Big Brother really exists. So he says, of course he exists. The party exists. Big Brother is the embodiment of the party. So then Winston asks, but does he exist in the same way that I exist? O'Brien says matter-of-factly, you do not exist. Then Winston goes into his head. He says, this is his consciousness speaking. He's like, once again, the same sense of helplessness assailed him. He knew or could imagine the arguments which proved his own non-existence. But they were nonsense. They were only a play on words. Did not the statement "you do not exist" contain a logical absurdity? But what was the use was it to say so? His mind shriveled as he thought of the unanswerable, mad arguments with which O'Brien would demolish him. So then Winston does say, because he's a heretic, he's a dissident, he says, I think I exist. But he says so wearily, because he's tired, he's been tortured brutally. He says, I think I exist. I am conscious of my own identity. I was born and I shall die. I have arms and I have legs. I occupy a particular point in space. No other solid object can occupy the same point simultaneously. In that sense, does Big Brother exist? If it is of no importance, he exists. No, those are two different sentences. O'Brien says, it is of no importance, he exists. Winston says, will Big Brother ever die? Then O'Brien says, of course not. How could he die? Next question. Then he asks, does the Brotherhood exist? So the Brotherhood, I think I said that in my previous video or not, I don't know. So the Brotherhood is like it's a dissident group so I told you, right, like there were a group of revolutionaries who stood up against the capitalist, and of them Big Brother has now set up his dictatorial rule, and he had chucked out all the other party members. One of them was Goldstein, who he made out to be a traitor. So the Brotherhood is led by Goldstein, but nobody knows if this is a myth or if it's a reality. So that's why, because Winston wants to believe that there is like this somebody out there who's trying to overthrow this tyrannical government. So which is why he asks O'Brien, does the Brotherhood exist? I read it almost as like in a very desperate tone, like please tell me it exists. And O'Brien says, that Winston, you will never know. If we choose to set you free when we've finished with you, if you live to be 90 years old, still you'll never know whether the answer to that question is yes or no. As long as you will live, it'll be an unsolved riddle in your mind. So you might as well not think about it ever again. So this is third chapter, page 249. I'm just gonna read the first couple of lines after I move on. I only want to read these 3 lines because here O'Brien talks about the 3 stages of reintegration. Remember when Winston asks, why am I here? And when O'Brien asks Winston, why are you here? And he says, because you want me to confess. He says, no, I want to cure you. So he calls that cure, he calls it reintegration. And under reintegration, there are 3 stages. One is learning, second is understanding, and third is acceptance. And it all sounds so benevolent, right? but it's the most evil, most... Anyway. So now we're on page 250. O'Brien asks Winston, remember this part in my previous videos where Winston says, I understand how, but I don't understand why. So O'Brien parrots it back to him. He says, so let us get back to the question of how and why. You understand well enough that how the party maintains itself in power. Now tell me why we cling to it. What is our motive? Why should we want power? Go on, speak. So here we have Winston, who believes that the party would say something like, or O'Brien would say something like, the party wants to remain in power because it's for the good of the people. We want what's best for you. This dictatorial regime, this totalitarian regime is for your own benefit, blah, blah, blah. So that's what Winston says. He says, you're ruling over us for our own good. You believe that human beings are not fit to govern ourselves, and therefore... He started and almost cried out. A pang of pain had shot through his body. O'Brien had pushed the lever of the dial up to 35. Surprising, right? That was stupid, Winston. That was stupid. You should know better than to say a thing like that. And then he pulls the lever back and continued. Now I will tell you the answer to my question. It is this. The party seeks power entirely for its own sake. We aren't interested in the good of others. We are interested solely in power. Not wealth or luxury or long life or happiness. Only power. Pure power. What pure power means, you will understand presently. We are different from all other oligarchies of the past, in that we know what we are doing. All the others, even those who resembled ourselves, were cowards and hypocrites. The German Nazis, the Russian communists, they came very close to us in their methods, but they could never have the courage to recognize their own motives. They pretended, perhaps they even believed, that they had seized power unwillingly and for a limited time. But that just around the corner, there lay a paradise where human beings would be free and equal. We are not like that. We know that no one ever seizes power with the intention of relinquishing it. Power is not a means, it's an end. One does not establish a dictatorship in order to safeguard a revolution. In fact, it's the opposite. One makes the revolution in order to establish the dictatorship. The object of persecution is persecution. The object of torture is torture. The object of power is power. Now do you begin to understand me? Winston was struck, as he had been before, by the tiredness of O'Brien's face. It was strong and fleshy and brutal. It was full of intelligence and a sort of controlled passion before which he himself felt helpless. But he was tired. There were pouches underneath his eyes. The skin sagged from the cheekbones. O'Brien leaned over him, deliberately bringing the worn face nearer. You are thinking, he said, that my face is old and tired. You are thinking that I talk of power, and yet I am not even able to prevent the decay of my own body. Can you not understand, Winston, that the individual is only a cell? The weariness of the cell is the vigor of the organism. Do you die when you cut off your fingernails? We are the priests of power, he said. God is power. But at present, power is only a word so as far as you are concerned. It's time for you to gather some idea of what power means. The first thing you must realize is that power is collective. The individual only has power insofar as he ceases to be an individual. Remember what I said? Submitting your identity to a collective, not to become a community, but to become unconscious and deadened. You know the party slogan, right? Freedom is slavery. Has it ever occurred to you that it is reversible, that slavery is freedom? Alone, free, the human being is always defeated. It must be so, because every human being is doomed to die, which is the greatest of all failures. But if he can make complete and utter submission, if he can escape from his identity, if he can merge himself in the party so that he is the party, then he is all-powerful and immortal. We all know what Tagore would say to that. But I don't want to talk about Tagore right now. I want to talk about O'Brien. He continues, the second thing for you to realize is that power is power over human beings, over the body, but above all, over the mind. Power over matter, which is external reality as you would call it, that's not important. Already our control over matter is absolute. For a moment, Winston ignored the dial. He made a violent effort to raise himself into a sitting position and merely succeeding in wrenching his body painfully. But how can you control matter? You don't even control the climate or the law of gravity. And then there's disease, there's pain, there's death. And O'Brien silenced him by a movement of his hand. We control matter because we control the mind. Reality is inside the skull. Remember mind over matter? You will learn by degrees, Winston. There's nothing that we do not do. Invisibility, levitation, anything. I could float off this floor like a soap bubble if I wish to. I do not wish to, because the party does not wish it. You must get rid of this 19th century idea of the laws of nature. We make the law of nature. But you do not. You're not even masters of this planet. What about Eurasia, East Asia? You've not even conquered them yet. That's unimportant. We shall conquer them when it suits us. And if we don't, what difference would it make? We can shut them out of existence. Oceania is the world. But the world itself is only a speck of dust, and man is tiny and helpless. How long has he been in existence? For millions of years. The earth was uninhibited. Wow, I just totally ruined that. Uninhibited. He said, nonsense. Pish posh. The earth is as old as we are, no older. How could it be older? Nothing exists except through human consciousness. Tagore would agree, but that's not what he means. Do you see how they take the same words but twist and invert and destroy the meaning? The rocks are full of bones of extinct animals, mammoths and mastodons and enormous reptiles which lived here long before man was ever heard of. So I'm reading all of this as an exasperated man who's trying so hard to hold on to, this fragment of reality that is being denied by utter lunacy. And so O'Brien is being totally rational and reasonable. He's like, but have you ever seen those bones, Winston? Of course not. 19th century biologists invented them. Before man, there was nothing. After man, if he came to an end, there would be nothing. Outside man, there is nothing. But the whole universe is outside of us. Look at the stars. Some of them are 1 million light years away. They are out of our reach forever. Then he's like, what are the stars? They are bits of fire a few kilometers away. We could reach them if we wanted to. Or we could blot them out. The earth is the center of the universe. The sun and the stars go around it. For certain purposes, of course, that's not true. When we navigate the ocean or when we predict an eclipse, we often find it convenient to assume that it's the earth that goes around the sun and that the stars are millions upon millions of kilometers away. But what of it? Do you suppose it's beyond us to produce a dual system of astronomy? The stars can be near or distant accordingly as we need them. Do you suppose our mathematicians are unequal to that? Have you forgotten double think? You complete fucking idiot. Winston shrank back upon his bed. Whatever he said, the swift answer crushed him like a bludgeon. And yet he knew that he was right. And see, now this is his intuition speaking. The belief that nothing exists outside your own mind. Surely that must be some way of demonstration that this was false. That had it not been exposed long ago as a fallacy, that there was even a name for it. Why could he not remember? A faint smile twitched the corners of O'Brien's mouth as he looked down at him. I told you, Winston, he said. The word you're trying to think of is solipsism. But you're mistaken. This is not solipsism. Collective solipsism maybe, but that's different. In fact, it's the opposite. This is digression. The real power, the power that we have to fight for night and day, is not the power over things, but over men. He paused, and for a moment assumed again his air of schoolmaster questioning a promising pupil. Now, how does a man assert his power over another, Winston? Winston thought. By making him suffer. Exactly, O'Brien says. Exactly, by making him suffer. Obedience is not enough unless he's suffering. How can you be sure he's obeying your will and not his own? So, what they're really trying to tear down is the will. is the ability to make your own decisions. It's the idea of self-determination. Remember, Panikkar talks about how freedom lies in self-determination, in being free from determination from without. That's exactly what they're trying to destroy. Power isn't tearing human minds to pieces and putting them together again in new shapes of your choosing. Do you begin to see then what kind of world we are creating? It is the exact opposite of the stupid hedonistic utopias that the old reformers imagined. A world of fear and treachery's torment, a world of trampling and being trampled on, a world which will grow not less but more merciless as it refines itself. Progress in our world will be progress towards more pain. The old civilization claimed that they were founded on love or justice. Ours, very clearly, it will be founded upon hatred. In our world, there will be no emotions except fear, rage, triumph, and self abasement. Everything else we shall destroy. Everything. Already we're breaking down the habits of thought which have survived before the revolution. We have cut the links between the child and the parent, and between man and man and woman. No one dares trust their wife or a child or a friend any longer. But in the future, there will be no there will be no wives or friends. Children will be taken from their mothers at birth, as one takes eggs from a hen. The sex instinct will be eradicated. Procreation will be an annual formality, like the renewal of a ration card. We shall abolish orgasm. Our neurologists are at work upon it now. There will be no loyalty except loyalty towards the party. There will be no love except the love of the big brother. There will be no laughter except the laugh of triumph over a defeated army. There will be no art, no literature, no science. When we are omnipotent, we shall have no more need of science. There will be no distinction between beauty and ugliness. There will be no curiosity, no enjoyment of the process of life. All competing pleasures will be destroyed. But always, do not forget this, Winston. Always, there will be the intoxication of power, constantly increasing and constantly growing subtler. Always, at every moment, there will be a thrill of victory, the sensation of trampling on an enemy who is helpless. There will be sadism. If you want a picture of the future, it is this. Imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. I remember that it is forever. The face will always be there to be stamped on. The heretic, the enemy of the society, will always be there so that he can be defeated and humiliated over and over again. Everything that you have undergone since you've been in our hands, all that will continue. And worse. The espionage, the betrayals, the arrests, the tortures, the executions, the disappearances, they will never cease. It will be a world of terror as much as a world of triumph. The more the party is powerful, the less it will be tolerant. The weaker the opposition, the tighter the despotism. Goldstein and his heresies will live forever. Every day, at every moment, they will be defeated, discredited, ridiculed, spat on, and yet they will always survive. The drama that I've played with you over the past 7 years will be played over and over again, generation after generation, always in subtler forms. Always we shall have the heretic here at our mercy, screaming with pain, broken up, contemptible, and in the end utterly penitent, saved from himself, crawling to our feet of his own accord. That is the world that we are preparing, Winston. A world of victory after victory, triumph after triumph after triumph. An endless pressing upon the nerve of power. You are beginning, I can see, to realize what that world will be like. But in the end, you will do more than understand it. You will accept it, welcome it, become a part of it. Winston had recovered significantly to speak. "You can't," he said weakly. "You can't." "And what do you mean by that remark, Winston?" "You can't create such a world as you've described. It's a dream. It's impossible." "Why?" "It's impossible to found a civilization on fear and hatred and cruelty. It will never endure." "And why not?" "It will have no vitality. It would disintegrate. It would commit suicide." "Nonsense. You're under the impression that hatred is more exhausting than love, but Why should that be? And if it were, what difference would that make? Suppose that we choose to wear ourselves out faster. Suppose that we quicken the tempo of human life till men are senile at 30. Still, what difference would it make? Can you not understand that the death of an individual is not death? The party is immortal. I don't know, I don't care. Somehow you will fail, something will defeat you. Life itself will defeat you. Tagore would agree, but O'Brien says, we control life, Winston. Life at all levels. You are imagining that there's something called human nature, which will be outraged by what we do and will turn against us. But we create human nature. Men are indefinitely malleable. Or perhaps you've returned to your old idea that the proletariats or the slaves will arise and overthrow us. Put it out of your mind. They are helpless. Like the animals, humanity is the party, the others are outside, they're irrelevant. I don't care, in the end they will beat you. Sooner or later they will see you for what you are and they will tear you to pieces. I don't care, in the end they will beat you. Sooner or later they will see you for what you are and they will tear you to pieces. Do you see any evidence of that happening? Or any reason why it should? No, but I believe it. I know that you will fail. There is something in the universe. I don't know, some spirit, some principle that you will never overcome. Do you believe in God, Winston? No. Then what is it, this principle that will defeat us? I don't know, the spirit of man. And do you consider yourself a man? Yes, I do. If you are a man, Winston, then you are the last man. Your kind is instinct. We are the inheritors. Do you understand that you are alone? You are outside history. You are non-existent. His manner changed and he said more harshly, and you consider yourself morally superior to us with our lies and our cruelty? Yes, I consider myself superior. And so in the next part, O'Brien basically holds Winston up to a mirror. So Winston has been tortured for 7 years, but he's lost track of time. So essentially what he sees in a mirror is an emaciated body. He looks totally unrecognizable. He looks pathetic. He looks weak. And he bursts into tears because at that point, however strong his beliefs may be, his body betrays his weakness. That, you know, the whole idea of ideas are bulletproof but people are not. You are rotting away, he said. You are falling to pieces. What are you? You're a bag of filth. Now turn around and look into that mirror again. Do you see that thing facing you? That's the last man. If you are human, that is humanity. Now go put your clothes on. We have beaten you, Winston. We have broken you up. You have seen what your body is like. Your mind is in the same state. I don't think there can be much pride left in you. You've been kicked and flogged and insulted. You have screamed with pain. You have rolled on the floor in your own blood and vomit. You have whimpered for mercy. You have betrayed everybody and everything. Can you think of a single degradation that has not happened to you? He says, I have not betrayed Julia. And Julia is his lover. So love is not allowed in this tyranny of the Big Brother, because love breeds contentment. Love has no space for hate. Love has no space for conflict. Love has no space for everything the Big Brother stands for. So loving is itself a heretical act. It is rebellion. So he says, I have not betrayed Julia. And so the interesting bit is what the idea of betrayal constitutes, because here he says, anyone else on earth would have answered promptly that he had in fact betrayed Julia. For what was there that they had not screwed out of him under the torture? 1 second, the lighting is off. Better? Yes? No? Okay. He had told them everything he knew of her, her habits, her character, her past life. He had confessed in the most trivial detail everything that had happened at their meetings. All that he had said to her, and she to him. Their black market meals, their adulteries, their weak plottings against the party. Everything. And yet, in the sense in which he intended the word, He hadn't betrayed her. He had not stopped loving her. His feelings toward her had remained the same. O'Brien had seen what he meant without the need for explanation. He says, yes, you didn't betray her. So this is a very interesting bit in the idea of submitting to the Big Brother, because submitting to Big Brother, to the party. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to fix the lighting. Yeah, I think this is still too much, but yeah, this is better. So submitting to Big Brother is not just in thought, it's also in heart, in soul. Like he says that you have to love Big Brother. You don't. It's not enough for you to submit to us. You have to love him. And so, which is why all. Okay. I'm not going to give anything away, because the next chapter, which I think is the last chapter, right? Second last chapter. The last chapter will tell you what really happens to Brian after a few more years of torture. It could be years, could be months, I don't know, because time sort of loses essence after a point. But yeah. So the idea of my point is, the reason I'm bringing this up is that it's not, love cannot be rationalized. And so no matter how much you may torture someone into giving away morbid what's the word, sordid details of their love affair, true betrayal is in the switching of the stream of love itself. It's not about giving away a name, it's about letting go of your ability to love them. It is putting yourself before them, putting the ego before the love, which he never did. So in that sense, he's still not yet the puppet of the party. He's still not given up his identity, because as long as your identity is tied up in love, you are no good for the brother, for the party, for Big Brother. You still need to be tweaked, still need to be cured.
This made Charlie want the memory to be real, and he began to convince himself that it likely was, and he had in fact just forgotten about it. Nick seemed so sure about it, and Charlie trusted Nick. "Oh yeah, I remember it now," Charlie exclaimed back to Nick. Charlie was still a little unsure when he said this, but was starting to find a clear memory forming in his head, which was enough for him to believe that it was real. In this moment, an entirely false memory was planted in Charlie's brain. Charlie was experiencing something fairly common. This occurrence happens every day to any number of people. A memory is formed, fabricated, or edited in addition to or in place of what really happened. In psychology, it is known as a confabulation or false memory, understood to be caused by psychological occurrences known as memory conformity, suggestibility, source misattribution, or the misinformation effect, as well as other things. Generally, in all cases, some cause, like a social influence, individual desire, misjudgment, emotional circumstance, etc., creates an error in the memory retrieval process, and as a result, a memory can end up becoming modified, or a false memory can be planted in the brain's memory center. In 1995, a study found that when a research conductor instructed a group of individuals to recall and describe specific childhood memories that were given to the conductor by the participants' parents, if 3 out of the 4 memories were real, but 1 was fake and intentionally suggested to the participant as real, about 25% of the participants believed that it was a real memory, and went on to describe it vividly and emotionally.
I think that was pretty self-explanatory, and you'll understand the significance of what I showed you when I begin the next chapter. So in the next chapter, Winston seems to be much more stronger. He seems to have regained his vigor. He's no longer a skeletal figure. He has been very well fed. He has become, he's become stronger. But what has changed is this. He seemed to have lost the power of intellectual effort now that the stimulus of pain had been removed. He was not bored. He had no desire for conversation or distraction. Merely to be alone, not to be beaten or questioned, to have enough to eat and to be clean all over was completely satisfying. So I want you to pay attention to the needs, to what his needs have been reduced to. Now he's like, now that I am not being constantly tortured by pain, I just don't want to go back and, put all that effort into thinking. All I want is to have food, to have shelter, to have a clean, hygienic sort of, lifestyle. And that's it. He just wants some peace and fucking quiet. And then he says, he could not fight the party any longer. Besides, the party was in the right. It must be so. How could the immortal collective brain be mistaken? By what external standard could you check its judgments? Sanity was statistical. It was merely a question of learning as they thought. Only. And here's the point of contention. So he's writing this all down. The pencil felt thick and awkward in his fingers because he's not written in years, right? He's been tortured. He began to write down the thoughts that came into his head. Why is the lighting so off? Stop. Anyway, he wrote first in large, clumsy capitals, freedom is slavery. Then he says, 2 and 2 makes 5. But then, and then finally he writes, God is power. He had accepted everything. The past was alterable, the past never had been altered. Oceania was at war with East Asia, Oceania had always been at war with East Asia. All the heretics who were found guilty, they were truly guilty of the crimes they were charged with. He had never seen a photograph that disproved their guilt. It never existed. He had invented it. What he believed in the past was a false memory. What he believes today is the real one. He remembered remembering contrary things, but those were false memories, products of self-deception. How easy it all was. Only surrender and everything else followed. It was like swimming against a current that swept you backwards, however hard you struggled. And then suddenly deciding to turn around and just go with the current. Instead of opposing it. Nothing had changed except your own attitude. The predestined thing happened in any case. He hardly knew why he ever rebelled. Everything was easy. Except anything could be true. The so-called laws of nature were nonsense. The law of gravity was nonsense. It presupposed that somewhere or other outside oneself there was a real world where real things happen. But how could there be such a world? What knowledge have we of anything save through our own minds? All happenings are in the mind. Whatever happens in all minds truly happens. The mind should develop a blind spot whenever a dangerous thought presented itself. The process should be automatic, instinctive, crime stop, they called it in New Think. So he had trained himself in not seeing or understanding the arguments that contradicted anything that the party said. It wasn't easy. It needed great powers of reasoning and improvisation. The arithmetical problems raised, for instance, by such statements as 2 and 2 is 5, were beyond his intellectual grasp. It also needed a sort of athleticism of the mind, an ability at one moment to make the most delicate use of logic, and at next to be unconscious of the crudest logical errors. Stupidity was as necessary as intelligence and as difficult to attain. So, the reason that video was shown before this chapter is that clearly a false memory has been planted in Winston's head, and it has been done through constant, consistent bouts of torture, in which no human being, and there's actually a very profound line in this book where it says, when experiencing pain, there are no heroes. That when you experience pain, all you want is to stop. You don't think of any loyalties, you don't think of any belief systems, all you want is for it to stop. You are at your most vulnerable, and that is the perfect time for someone to manipulate your belief systems, because you are so free, you are willing to let them go because you are in so much pain. And so now his mind has been emptied of pain. His life has been emptied of pain, and his mind has just it has been hollowed out. He talks about this kind of blank space where thoughts used to be, and which is why he wants nothing more than just peace and quiet. So he continues to talk about his life as somebody who's now finally reasonably converted to the party ideologies. But then then there's this one instant where suddenly he starts up with a shock of horror. The sweat broke out on his backbone. He heard himself cry out loud, "Julia! Julia! My love, Julia!" For a moment, he had an overwhelming hallucination of her presence. She seemed not merely with him, but inside him, in his heart. It was as though she'd gone into the texture of his skin. In that moment, he had loved her far more than he'd ever loved, than he had ever done when they were together and free. Also, he knew that somewhere or the other, she was still alive and needed his help. He obeyed the party, but he still hated the party. In the old days, he'd hidden a heretical mind beneath an appearance of conformity. Now that he'd retreated a step further, that is, in his mind, he'd surrendered, but he had hoped to keep the inner heart inviolate. He knew that he was in the wrong, but he preferred to be in the wrong. They would understand that. O'Brien would understand it. It was all confessed in a single foolish cry, which is to say, he knew that they were coming for him. For the first time, he perceived that if you want to keep a secret, you must also hide it from yourself. You must know all the while that it is there, but until it is needed, you must never let it emerge into your consciousness in any shape that could be given a name. From now onwards, he must not only think right, he must feel right, dream right. Only think right, he must feel right, dream right. And all the while, he must keep his hatred locked up inside him like a ball of matter, which was a part of himself and yet unconnected with him. A kind of cyst. And sure enough, O'Brien finds him. So he believes that the only way that he would be free would be to die hating him, to die hating the party. And it was very difficult for him to accept, because he says it was more difficult than accepting an intellectual discipline. It was a question of degrading himself, mutilating himself. He had got to plunge into the filthiest of filth. What was the most horrible, sickening thing of all? He thought of the big brother, the enormous face. Because of constantly seeing it on all the posters, he always thought of it as being a meter wide. What were his true feelings about the big brother? And then O'Brien finds him. He says, "Get up, come here." Winston stood opposite him. O'Brien took Winston's shoulders and between his strong hands looked at him closely. "You have thoughts of deceiving me. That was stupid. Stand up straighter and look at me in the face." He paused and went on in a gentler tone. "You are improving. Intellectually, there is very little wrong with you. It's only emotionally that you have failed to make progress. Tell me, Winston, and remember, no lies. You know that I'm always able to detect a lie. Tell me, what are your true feelings about the big brother?" Winston says, "I hate him." "You hate him? Good. Then the time has come for you to take the last step. You must love big brother. It's not enough to obey him. You must love him." And so now we're on the final chapter of the book. He has been taken to room 101, which is supposed to be the worst. It's feared by every prisoner at the Ministry of Love, and only the people who go there know what the secret of room 101 is. But everyone knows is it's the worst place to be. So O'Brien essentially says that room 101, it holds the worst thing in the world, but that worst thing, it varies from individual to individual. It may be burial alive, or death by fire, or by drowning, or impalement, or 50 other deaths. Then there are cases where it's also quite trivial, not even fatal. So think of a boggart, all of you who've read Harry Potter. Like, everyone has a fear and it takes a different shape or form. And guess what O'Brien's fear is? It is a fear of rodents. So I'm not going to read out this chapter. Oh, this is not the last chapter. इसके बाद एक और chapter है. So in this chapter, essentially, O'Brien he has a cage of rodents which he which he brings close to Winston's face, threatening him with death, not just death but mutilation, death by mutilation. That I'm going to put this cage of rodents onto your head, and they're going to eat you out. They're going to attack your eye sockets. They're going to attack your cheekbones, into which they'll enter your tongue and rip it out. I'm so sorry for all those for whom this is very disturbing, but this whole book is very disturbing. So and that's the worst kind of death Winston can imagine. And guess what he does to evade it? The mask was closing on his face. The wire brushed his teeth. And then, no, it was relief, only hope, a tiny fragment of hope. Too late, perhaps too late. But he had suddenly understood that in the whole world there was just one person to whom he could transfer his punishment, one body that he could thrust himself between himself and the rats. And he was shouting frantically over and over, "Do it to Julia, do it to her, not me, Julia. I don't care what you do to her. Tear her face off, strip her to the bones. Not me, Julia, not me, please." He was falling backwards into enormous depths away from the rats. He was still strapped in the chair, but he had fallen through the floor, through the walls of the building, through the earth, through the oceans, through the atmosphere, into outer space, into the gulfs between the stars, always away, away, away from the rats. He was light years distant, but O'Brien was still standing at his side. There was still the cold touch of the wire against his cheek, but through the darkness that enveloped him, he heard another metallic click and knew that the cage door had clicked. So I interpret this kind of distance not just of Winston's distance from the rats, but Winston's distance, like his final separation from his identity, that he has finally fallen through his self, which was contained in love. That once, as soon as he was willing to sacrifice his love for Julia, he was an alien to himself. So we actually do. I have we've in Ecosophy, which is taught by my professor Asim Srivastava. So in this book called The Human Condition by Hannah Arendt, this is called Alienation of the Self. So I'm sorry, I haven't read the book, but it talks about various levels of alienation, and essentially it talks about how the idea of solipsism and how we look at ourselves when we are disconnected from ourselves. We look at ourselves through an Archimedean point, which is a point outside of us rather than inside of us. So think of it like that. I know it's a little complicated explanation to something very simple, but I think it's important because it essentially talks about how the love that he held for Julia, that lay inside of him, he surrendered that love, he gave it up, and now there was nothing emanating from him, but there was everything that was looking at him from afar. Everything that he knew of himself that lay away from him, and everything that he saw was through the eyes of the party that was outside of him, and in some ways inside of him. So I'm probably totally butchering what Hannah Arendt was trying to say, but I am not only trying to explain what she said, but also trying to connect it to what is happening in this book. And so please, I apologize for not being nuanced enough and for not doing my academic work, because I'm doing other readings. So, but do look it up. It's a very fascinating read from what I've heard. So now we're at the last chapter. I'm not going to read it out, but I'm just going to explain it to you. So he's finally surrendered to Big Brother, intellectually and emotionally. And he has become an outcast, and he is also now of no importance to Big Brother and the party. He is no longer under the watchful eyes of Big Brother, because they now know that he's a slave. And so he's free to do whatever he wants, and his life is devoid of any meaning. And in this chapter, he happens to bump into Julia, where both of them admit that they betrayed each other. So basically, they also talk about how both of them have been surgically, their appearance has been surgically altered, and they're unrecognizable. Even the touch of each other has changed, because she feels like she's made of stone, and he is bloated, and they're just unrecognizable. Not only have their inner identities been totally destroyed, but their outer appearances have been altered as well. So as they look at each other, as they sort of bump into each other, he says that she looked directly at him for the first time. It was only a momentary glance, but it was full of contempt and dislike. And he wondered whether it was a dislike that came purely out of the past, or whether it was inspired also by his bloated face and the water that the wind kept squeezing from his eyes. So he was wondering whether this is all this is indoctrination, or is this some kind of physical disgust with his body. I betrayed you, she said boldly. I betrayed you, he said. She gave him another quick look of dislike. Sometimes, she said, they threaten you with something you can't stand up to, can't even think about. And then you say, don't do it to me, do it to someone else, do it to so and so. And perhaps you might pretend afterwards that was only a trick, that what you just said made them stop and didn't really mean it. But that's not true. At the time when it happens, you do mean it. You think there's no way of saving yourself, and you're quite ready to save yourself that way. You want it to happen to the other person. You don't give a damn that they suffer. All you care about is yourself. All you care about is yourself, he echoes. And after that, you don't feel the same way towards the other person any longer. No, he said, you don't feel the same. So essentially, this encounter shows how they ultimately surrender to their most base level. That human beings' most basic instinct is their instinct to survive, and how both of them surrendered to their survival instinct, and in that moment they gave up their highest selves, their ability to love. They betrayed their loved ones. And if there is a definition of pure evil, it is a lack of love, a lack of empathy. It's a lack of any kind of feeling towards another human being, any kind of benevolent feeling towards another human being. And in that moment, when they both decided that they want to surrender to each other, that they wanted to surrender to the power of the party, because they just couldn't take it anymore, they lost their essence. And the essence of human nature is love. And once you give it up, you are nobody, you are nothing, which is exactly what the party wanted. And so now we have reached the end of this book, and I hope you understand why this series, these particular videos are called Persuasion versus Reality, because this is something that I inferred, this insight that I inferred from this book, which is that because subservience is misunderstood as reverence, dissent becomes a crime. And so, dissenters must be punished. And the way in which they are punished is to eradicate their reasons for dissent, which is their core beliefs in love. And love is a reality, as much as it is a feeling, as much as it is a philosophy, as much as it is a choice, as much as it is intangible. It's a reality, it is an experience, even if you can't maybe make an experiment of love, or maybe you can. It is a fact and it's a value, so in which way you can make an experiment of love. My point is that the only way in which you can make a person disbelieve their most deepest beliefs is by persuading them that their beliefs are wrong. And like I have said before, that persuasion, that manipulation happens in their most vulnerable. And their most vulnerable comes through pain and torture. Through pain and torture comes obedience. So the party has it all planned. They are very aware of what they're doing. O'Brien says it himself that we want power for power. We don't want to make the world a better place. We don't believe that that a dictatorship can ever benefit humankind. We know it's for their worse. We want that. We want to be immortal. Do you know there's all the Potterheads? There's this whole thing now that Voldemort says there is no good and bad. There is pure power. That's what they're all about. That as long as the ideology of Big Brother is alive, it doesn't matter if he's in a physical form or not. That as long as I can persuade you into believing that he's real, it doesn't matter if you can prove his existence or not. Because if your mind disbelieves your mind, then what do you believe? You believe anything else, any other tangible thing that you can find. And what is that tangible thing? The party's ideologies that prove by destroying truth through falsified evidence कि ये सच है और जो तुम सोच रहे हो वो झूठ है क्योंकि you think there's this thing na, by the quote by Descartes, I think therefore I am. So they are like, no, you think wrong. Your thinking does not it does not mean that you exist. Your thoughts are an illusion. Reality itself is an illusion. What is real is what we say, is the reality we create for you. So the whole idea of stripping away an identity of an individual and creating this idea of collectivism, which by itself sounds very benevolent, but it's of course it's not. We know that. So yeah, that's the end of these videos. I hope you liked them. This has been really exhausting for me, because not just because of the large chunk of the book that I've covered, but because of how intense and painful some parts of this are. And yeah, anyway, okay, this is Har Ghar Shaheen Bagh. No, this is not Har Ghar Shaheen Bagh. 1984 was a different text altogether. Anyway, I need to take a break. Bye guys, I'll see you. I think I have another idea for 1984. I think that might be the last set of videos I'll do for this. Maybe not, let's see. But for now we're done. Bye.